morning, sun. How are you? Skies above. Gee, it's great to be alive and love. Good morning, sun. Good morning, sun. Good morning, life. Good morning, sun. How are you?
And good morning. Yummy cheers. Welcome to episode 82 of me drinking coffee and talking about random stuff. Welcome. Pull up a drink. Friday morning here in California, and I guess Friday evening. Yep. Early Friday evening over in Europe. Greetings, and lots of different times everywhere else. So today's theme is, are you prepared? And this may just be me geeking out about something that I do and no one else does. Like, I may be in some very, very, very small minority of people who like cares about this at all and like bothers with it. It's not a big deal for me. It's just something I do, and it's like I learn, and it's kind of fun stuff. But apparently that makes me a little weird, which I'm kind of used to, but interesting. I learned a few things. So good morning, evening, Jeremy. Greetings from Sweden, and I hope your family approves of my hat. My daughter had some blinky Christmas light, blinky Christmas light necklace, but she might have taken it to school. I don't see it, so I don't know where it is. And if you have any teenage daughters, you know that trying to search in the mess that is their bedroom is a futile venture. So I didn't bother. So, yeah, it's just the hat today. Sorry, no theatrics with the lights. So it started with a tweet where I was on I think it was a Teams call, I don't know, some type of remote desktop sharing call with a customer, or it might have been a consultant who was working for a customer. And in the middle of the call, it just cut out, and like I couldn't hear her anymore. And then the call disconnected. I was like, okay, was it something I said? But then like she got back to me, emailed me, or we reconnected. And when we reconnected in the call, she said, oh, the power went out due to weather, and her internet went out immediately. I was like, okay. For me, that's strange. For my own reasons. For others, I've learned that's strange for completely different reasons. I don't know where she was. I don't know if she was in United States or in Canada. But anyway, momentary outage. So her power went out briefly, and within 2 minutes we were back on the phone. So it was a momentary outage, and that told me, well, she doesn't have any type of UPS on her internet connection. Even if she's using a laptop, she said her internet went down as well when the power went out. So I was like, okay. So sitting next to me in my office, I built this rolling power rack, for lack of a better term, because these things are pretty heavy. These are two APC Smart Ups UPS devices, and I've had something like this for many years. Got the first one, 16 years ago or so. Someone gave me a used one they had refurbed, so that started my journey of having a server grade UPS. And I've just always had them because I've had servers, one form or another, that I've kept up during the day, and I didn't want to have any interruption with power. They don't kick in often, but even a 1 second power dip or half a second power dip can cause problems. And I also have, which I'll talk about later, some devices that are definitely not friendly with power outages, right? Like the Linux, my impression is the Linux-based OSs, no bueno when it comes to a power outage. Like the disk needs to be resynced. You got RAID arrays. It's not pretty. So that's another reason why I have these things. And, for me, it's a business expense. It's part of running my company. I happen to be at home, but if I were in an office, I would have the same thing for my servers. So it's like, I don't even think about it. Now, if you're just a home user and you're working for a company, you're an employee and you're not maintaining any infrastructure, yeah, this doesn't make sense. If it's just you and your laptop and you just happen to be working remotely from home and everything is remote and hosted and managed by your IT organization or whatever, this isn't relevant. But what was interesting was the surprising conversation that came out of this on Twitter. And so Luke said, never really thought of it. And like others have mentioned, so far not an issue out here. And I hope he was joking, but he says, if it's to guarantee you being up during calls and the other person isn't, why bother? Well, that was I think it's the first time I've encountered that. For me, it's not about if the other person loses connection or me dropping off from a call. That's trivial, but for me, it's just overall uptime. And I actually have been on a call when the power went out, and I was on the call for a full hour working off a battery. I had to turn off the beeping noises of the UPSs, but yep, I worked through a full hour of uptime, and by the time I was done, the batteries were almost shot. And so I forget if I had a generator at that time, but had to kind of shut things down at that point. And then Simon says, the only time I lost power was an expected or planned outage for maintenance because there was maintenance on the main line. Haven't experienced an outage besides that. He does have a UPS for his NAS, which I fully agree on the NAS side. Maybe it's different in Germany compared to US, so you're starting to see a theme here. I have a small UPS to keep my NAS, primarily because of that. Router switch in home server lab turned on for 15 minutes. So I think makes total sense. So, for most people, if you don't need to have your server on all day and you're going to be home when the power goes out potentially, yeah, 15, 20 minutes is fine. And then Fenno replied, yeah, you're about the only one who would have something like that, but it depends on how much you work from home. Yes. So I am working from home every day, all day for the last 14 years. So for me, this is totally like no big deal. This is my infrastructure. And so Martin replies, needing backup power at home is a weird concept. In Europe, the power doesn't go out when it rains, but it does in the USA. And there were other comments like this. And I was like, that's interesting. When I was a kid, I grew up in Las Vegas, and it was just routine. Granted, this was in, early 70s. And the routine was whenever it started to rain or whenever there was bad weather coming in, we would just bring out the flashlight. We had this one big flashlight, and that was the, quote, emergency flashlight. And it was much more an emergency flashlight. It was just the routine power out flashlight, because back then in Las Vegas, whenever there was a storm, windstorm, rainstorm, that was pretty much the only two things, the power would go out, like 90% chance. And, probably certain reasons for that. Rapidly growing town, middle of the desert, very wide open, and the storms were pretty severe. You get, 60 mile an hour winds. Every time it rained, we'd have flash flooding, just take out streets. So it was severe weather every single time there was a storm. And I'm assuming that took down a power line somewhere, caused a transformer problem, whatever the infrastructure was at that time. But it was no big deal. We'd get out the flashlight, maybe one or two candles. We'd hang out and have fun as kids, right? No big deal. And it usually didn't last that long, maybe an hour, a couple hours. I don't think we ever had a full day outage. So usually just a couple hours. And once the storm died down, then things would turn back on. So I'm like, So I looked into this and tried to find articles that discussed European versus US power reliability. Unfortunately, I was not able to find anything that I would call good and objective. Nearly every single article I found was highly politicized. So I'll take the example, the most common one I found was discussion of the German energy grid. So Germany has, and one article touted Germany as having the most reliable energy grid in the world. Less than X minutes of average downtime per year, and how they have the best energy grid in the world. So that was like 2014. Then I find another article that says, oh, Germany has this massive problem with renewables. They have too much renewables, too much wind. They're having to give it away by paying customers to take it, so negative energy rates. They're having to shed load. They're having to do whatever the process is to kind of shunt that energy, the excess energy, because it's actually causing a problem in the grid and keeping it balanced, and it's an excess energy. And so whatever this article was, it was trying to criticize Germany for this improper handling of excess green energy, which is a rather, weird concept. But then I found another article a year later that says, oh, there's not enough wind now, and so now Germany has an energy shortage. And of course, they use the term crisis, probably, Germany energy crisis. So every single article I found was political. It was like trying to attack something about the politics of the nation, the politicians, the energy policy. So I was literally unable to find objective information to explain to me, like, I believe what these people are saying. Let's say that European energy is just like 5 nines reliable. And I found some online comments where someone said, yeah, I went my entire life in Germany without having a single unplanned power outage. He had one planned power outage, this comment I saw. It's like, wow, that's pretty amazing. So I'm assuming there are some very fundamental differences between certain European countries, how they manage their grid, and US. And, we could buy the same transformers. We could have the same cables. We could have the same interconnects and switching systems. But even if we had the same equipment, I'm guessing there's some fundamental political, cultural, economic differences between our systems, such that the European countries, many European countries, have more reliable power. For instance, regulations. They may have a completely different energy regulation scheme than the US. And maybe there was some transition from regulated to deregulated. I don't know how that worked in Europe. I think the US went through that, and California certainly did. And California had all sorts of zaniness as part of the, quote, deregulation of the energy markets that occurred 20 years ago. And let's see if this phone call goes away. And so I'm assuming that's one, regulation. So if a country requires certain power regulations, certain reliability standards, certain infrastructure and construction standards, that may just fundamentally alter the reliability. Maybe there's a different design pattern that is used in, say, Germany that says, okay, you must have a redundant path for certain levels of infrastructure, such that, if this type of failure occurs, you must have this type of redundant situation. And that reduces or minimizes or virtually eliminates outages at the household level. I don't know. I mean, they must have outages at some point, but maybe there's redundant paths that essentially hide that for the energy consumer. And then, there are all sorts of potential infrastructure and design differences that may be made. And also fundamentally, I think there may be some difference in the North American grid at 120 volts versus other countries. The voltage may make a difference. I don't think so, because I think we just have step-down transformers that go to, two-phase, and that's 240 that gets split into 120, 120. I don't know that that's fundamentally too much different, but I think the distribution design is very different. So once you go from your main substation, the distribution in the US is quite a bit different than in European and other countries on 240 volt standard. So yeah, but I also saw articles that said, yes, Germany has very high reliability, but several articles saying that Germany does have the highest average electricity cost in the world. And because everything is political, I had to look this up. And there's actually an organization called Eurostat, and it confirmed it. Now, obviously, there's probably a blend of prices within there, but I think Germany was around 38 cents per kilowatt hour average. And I don't know if that's euro cents or if that was dollar equivalent. Now that I think about it, it's probably euro cents, which would make it pretty crazy high in US dollar terms. So if they have those standards for reliability that require that type of infrastructure, it's more expensive. Sure, it obviously would cost more. That makes total sense. So anyway, I'm rambling. Anyway, it was surprisingly difficult to get an explanation as to why, right? Like, there's got to be a technical reason. Like, we use this wiring, we use this switching gear, we have this fault tolerance, or we have this load management. I don't know. There's some grid management science going on there. So why do I care about this at all? Well, this is my global headquarters. It looks something like this, but much less blue, much less shiny, much less organized, wires all over the place, and a cat mixed in there. So I have had a Hyper-V server for somewhere around 14 years, more or less. And I've had that on a dedicated PC that I want to have up all the time. And I had anywhere from, say, 4 to, early days, I could maybe run 4 VMs in the 16 gigs of RAM or whatever's available. And now I can run 20 VMs in 64 or 128 gigs of RAM. So I have pretty much a mini data center on my Hyper-V server that I can use to spool up any number of applications and servers and desktops. And I have 2 Synology NAS units, and I have learned that those absolutely do not like being shut down without power. So hard shutdown is not a good thing with those. Sometimes they can recover, sometimes they are not happy, and even if they do recover, it has to do a consistency check, which can take days depending on the configuration. So I was like, nope, that thing needs to be seriously reliable power, period, like 0 fluctuations. So I have that on a NAS as well. I personally run an NVR server for my little IP cams, so I have that on an UPS as well, just so that's constantly running. So if the power goes out, I still have surveillance cameras and videos, and I don't have any issues with that machine going down because it just stays on 24/7. I now have a Docker server for Business Central, and so I keep that up. Sometimes I shut it down, but now I keep it up pretty much 24/7 because that also runs my DevOps build agent and pipelines. And all of my dev Docker servers are there, so that stays up. And I've been doing this for 14 years, so it's pretty standard and routine for me. And for me to have a couple UPSs for a couple $100, it's not a huge investment. I replace the batteries every few years with the name brand batteries. I've tried the cheap ones and paid the price. So yeah, it's pretty routine. It's not a big deal for me. So when people freak out and say, wow, you're weird for having UPSs, like, this is my business. Like, I want my lights to be on, or I want my servers running. I don't want to interrupt, because my calculation is, let's say it's $1,000 for every day of downtime that I have. Like, UPSs pay for themselves in a few hours. It's not a hard math equation there. And I'm supporting now like 700 customers or something like that. So I want to have availability. Even if the power goes out or I have power fluctuations, I don't want to be futzing with my servers, doing disk rebuilds or, RAID rebuilds or things like that, consistency checks. So yeah. And this amazing global infrastructure at my global headquarters allows me to live stream to up to 5 people. I think right now maybe 4. But anyway, welcome all 4 of you. Yes, if the power went out right now, I know it'd be a shocker, and I don't know if everyone would be able to recover. So, Steve, I hear you saying, why do you deal with all this stupid infrastructure? Get into the 90s, Steve. Get into the 21st century. There's this thing called the cloud. Hello. Well, there's a couple reasons why I don't have everything in the cloud, and these may be fairly obvious, but in case they're not, one, It is expensive. For me, I've looked into this repeatedly over the years. For me to host my Hyper-V servers over the last 14 years in something like Azure, hosted VMs, they're really expensive. And you say, well, you can get the burstable Azure VMs. They're $30 a month. Yeah, you can, and they're horrible. They're absolutely dismally useless for what I do. I even had a support case with Azure, like, why is this VM so bad? Like, I can't even copy a file to disk. And the reason is that, at least in Azure, from what I've found, even for their more expensive tiers, I/O is the most expensive component of VMs. If you want disk I/O, you have to pay a ton of money. And I'm not going to pay $300+ a month just so that I can work with 5 GB files on disk. It's ludicrously expensive. I don't need 256 gigs of RAM. I don't need 5 TB of disk. I just need fast I/O. But in order to get that with Azure, even with premium SSDs, you don't get it by default. You have to buy higher tier VMs to get that higher I/O. Now, maybe there's some obscure offering and switch that you can enable that, but you're going to pay for it. I/O, from what I found, is very, very expensive in Azure. Whereas I slap a consumer SSD into a desktop, and I'm getting blazing fast I/O that just runs circles around any Azure VM that I could possibly afford at a reasonable price. So yeah, cost is highly prohibitive for what I do. Now, if you're just doing web hosting or light web apps or something, there may be a different configuration, but at the VM level, not possible. Next, the party line is that the cloud is more secure. Well, if you just search for data breaches, I think that one's pretty shot. Now, maybe AWS and Google Cloud or Azure, they have some infrastructure components that do have higher level security. But everyone else under that top tier data platform or SaaS platform provider or PaaS platform provider, man, like data breaches galore. I've been so many data breaches, like I just get the notification and shrug, like, have I been pwned? I'm like, oh, cool. I'm a member of a new club with 300 million other people. So data breaches are an issue. I'm afraid, like I store my files on OneDrive. I fully expect OneDrive to be compromised and have my data, accessed. It's like, I just don't trust it. There are just so many data breaches. And even if it's not a disclosed data breach, government data breaches and government agencies, whatever you want to call them, NSO group, right? We know the compromises exist. And the latest Log4j, right? Geez, it's kind of difficult to believe that anything is impenetrable these days. And then there is my more recent concern. The cloud is more reliable than your on-prem servers. Well, I used to think that as well. And, I mostly deal with Microsoft services, and I gotta say, the last year is not really holding up to that standard. One outage in one service in the Microsoft infrastructure affects 50 different products, customers around the world, and it becomes a problem. So Business Central may be running perfectly fine, but if you can't authenticate through the Microsoft authentication, Azure authentication infrastructure, because of some weird patch that got rolled out, then Business Central might as well be down. And we've seen that several times now. I don't know what all the causes are, but in this latest one, Microsoft 365 says, oh, there's an issue logging into Outlook. No, that's how it started, but it turns out that potentially dozens of Microsoft platform applications, including Business Central, were affected. It was momentary. I think they resolved it in 2 hours or so, but still, it's like, why is this not working? So I don't think that's like just a simple line you can say, oh, it's more reliable. It depends, right? So I know on my server, I've had maybe 30 minutes of downtime because I had to reconnect a SATA cable. That was recently. It's been there for over 5 years, running flawlessly. And after 5 years, I had to unplug a cable and plug it back in. It's been working fine. So I have 30 minutes of downtime over 5 years. Pretty good on a consumer grade PC, desktop PC running as my server. So I'm able to support that. That works for me. And then, of course, this morning, we're trying to prep a new release for AppSource. And my developer sends me a message saying, yeah, I have the new release and it works fine for me, but like there's some pipeline issues here. So yeah, he looks up the status and sees this. And he was eventually able to process it. I haven't checked lately, but it says pipelines are degraded in DevOps. It's like, okay, so, if DevOps pipelines don't work, do we need to have a contingency in place where we run that process manually? And it's like, this is the magical cloud that we've been promised, right? So, I don't know. It's not a panacea. So for these reasons, it is much cheaper for me to host myself this infrastructure, and even having the UPS is not a problem. And then, concern about security and uptime, it's not necessarily a clear-cut answer anymore. So anyway, like, what do we poor folk in the US with the unreliable power, we're like a third world electrical grid country, what do we poor people do here in the US? Well, Kristen Hosman was in a massive storm recently, like 60, 80, up to 100 mile an hour winds in the mountains of Colorado and outside of Denver. And so massive windstorm, her power went out, and she does have some battery backups. You can see there's an APC UPS on the left. It's in the shadows, the black one. And then that is powering that's powering her computers. Then they plugged in the Jackery. They have one of those nice lithium-ion Jackery units that powers the APC UPS. So, she's got the reliability from the APC, and then she's got the extended runtime from the Jackery. Great economical, simple solution if you just have a limited set of components you need to keep up. So that worked great, and she could run for, I think she said 15 plus hours on that. Now, I have gone the next step, and I do have my battery backups, but like it started to get annoying, and for various reasons that I'll talk about, I got some generators. So for the same reason, if I have a day of downtime, whether that's, I have had full days of downtime due to planned maintenance. So they had to replace a couple power poles in my area, and so they had to shut down my portion of the neighborhood. And that was like a 12-hour outage while they had to replace those poles because they're on high tension lines, I guess. And so I ran off a generator for full 12 hours and flawless. I was the only one in the neighborhood with the lights on my house at night. So that was kind of fun, actually. And because of, I then got a transfer switch. I had to replace my electrical panel because it was 40 plus years old. And so while doing that, I had a transfer switch installed so I could just plug the generator into my circuit breaker and not have to run extension cords. When I did that, I could have higher load on my generator, like my refrigerator, which my 2,000 watt generator in econ mode can't handle that sudden surge from the compressor. So I got the second generator, which handles the refrigerator easily in econ mode and also lets me power anything in my house. So I can run my whole house from two little portable generators. So it works fine for me. I've only had to use them once or twice. So, in 8 years of living here, once was for that maintenance and then the other one was momentary. So anyway, pretty simple for me. Now, throughout the US or elsewhere in the US, there's a legitimate need for a different solution. And so on the left there, that's a Kohler whole house generator. That's a typical residential generator. And that's one that a friend got installed out in New Jersey because they have rainstorms and snowstorms and they have hurricanes. So Hurricane Sandy pretty big storm, like there's only so much you can do to fortify yourself against those massive storms. And at some point, power gets taken out or something gets damaged, a tree falls, and you have some power outages. So middle of winter, it's not fun to not have power or heat. So my friend invested in that, and works great. Powered the whole house, no problem. And it's fairly routine. My understanding is particularly in the Northeast and anywhere where there's snow, these are very common. They run off of natural gas or propane, and you can go for days on these things and not have any worries. And if you're rural, you're 30 miles outside of town and you've just got one power line feeding that area, these become very practical, and it's just part of the cost of living in there, just like you need to have your own propane or your own septic system, your own water reservoir, whatever that is. You're kind of independent. You need to be self-reliant in those rural areas. And a friend is building a new, I don't know how big it is, it must be massive, a new house, fair away from a town, but in a community. And he's got hundreds of, several 100-watt panel or whatever the 100-amp panel, several hundred amps of panels in his new large house. And so rather crazy. He is looking at a Kohler commercial generator, and I think he's looking at the 38 kilowatt generator. It's a beast. So it's like a V8 engine, runs off of natural gas or propane, and it's a monster. And apparently that's just the standard with these large houses, these high-end houses. It's a pretty high-end house. So he's getting this beast trucked in and hooked up to his massive bank of electrical panels. So, he can afford it. It's not a big deal. So that's what he does. So it's fairly common here. So you say, well, why does U.S. electricity have outages? What's the problem? Like, what are you guys doing? Well, I think, like I said, I tried to find differences, but didn't find anything that wasn't, didn't have an angle and had objective information. One is, above ground power lines are fairly common in the U.S. and North America. And so this is actually, these power poles here are actually in my city. It's a photo I found online, and you see one's at an angle. So I'm assuming a car hit that pole. And so, it looks like it's intact, but in order to repair it, they probably have to de-energize those lines. And those are not your typical just household lines. These are, maybe 10, 20,000 volts running through there. So they have to de-energize that line, repair the pole, replace it. It takes a full day. So you have an outage because of that. So above ground poles, you have damage, you have weather, and stuff like that. So that makes sense as to why these outages occur. You say, well, why don't you guys in the US, why don't you poor energy folks in the US use underground lines? We do. But if you know enough about electrical grid design, you should know that below ground wiring is not a panacea. It improves some risk factors, but it is not risk free. So this is an example of what, I don't know if it's a common term, but they call this an underground vault. And this is where the underground power lines are run, and these are the interconnection points and the service points. This is a photo of an explosion of an underground power vault that occurred in my city, and the fire department has to roll out on this and deal with it along with the power company. And I've spoken to the firemen who actually have to attend to these calls, and they said, no, underground power has its own issues, and these things catch fire and explode. And something isn't, some connection isn't right, or overloaded, or loose, or corroded, or old, or whatever, maintenance issue probably. They overheat, and if you have any hydrogen or any type of gas in there, they explode and blows this lid off, covers those cars with mud. And then you have a power outage. Again, de-energize, service, and then come back up. So that takes several hours. So I'm assuming Europe must have some type of redundant circuit architecture such that they can have alternate feeds to the same area. I don't see how else it can be done. Just like internet connections, right? Your main connection goes down, you've got to have a backup coming from a different direction in order to have redundant, fault-tolerant supplies. So anyway, so Jeremy says, U.S. doesn't like to do maintenance on underground systems, and there's, in a case of a road sinkhole, 1854 made wood water main collapse. So, yes, but U.S. criticizes itself. We don't need external criticism. There are plenty of people who criticize U.S. infrastructure for not keeping up with the maintenance, and sure, I'm sure that exists, but if you think other countries are out of the woods here or are without fault, just wait 10, 20, 30 years. All countries have infrastructure challenges, right? Just depends on when their growth phase was and when they put their systems in place. And maybe there are higher budgets that take care of some of that maintenance, but they come at a cost, right? So let's assume that the U.S. is choosing to balance economy over reliability, which seems to be the case, is my guess, both in design and maintenance. So, okay, so we have some outages, but we theoretically benefit from lower prices. I don't know how true that is, certainly not in California, given the particular structure we have in Southern California. But anyway, I don't know. I'm literally unable to find objective information on what's going on because there's always some angle where someone wants to dig at someone else and say it's someone else's fault. And so just depends on who you ask. But I don't really care personally, like whatever. I'm not in the political or economic or, power company criticism. I'm just like, I just want uptime. So that's fine for me. I'm happy to have UPS as a generator. It's not a big deal for me. If others don't want it, no problem. So Jeremy pointed to this, which I had in my YouTube queue. It is a SciShow channel video on YouTube. And it coincidentally recently came out December 15th, 2 days ago. Why has the U.S. had so many power outages? Now, again, there's a premise to that title, right? There's an angle. There's a presupposition. They do talk about, they do offer some statistics, but if you listen carefully to the words they use, there's a lot of supposition in the statements they make. And they don't, it's almost like pseudo speculation about why certain things are happening, but I think is a fairly good overview of what might be going on. And they talk about the infrastructure, the maintenance, old infrastructure, the grid design. There's lots of factors that feed into this. It's not just one simple thing. So in my neighborhood, I know, which I've never had this problem before, my neighborhood has fully underground power infrastructure. So say, well, you guys need underground wiring. I do. Everything is underground. I actually have the local transformer in my backyard. They replaced it a few years ago. I couldn't find photos. It was really cool. Having a crane with this several 1,000-pound transformer literally lifted over my house freaked me out. That was an uncomfortable experience. But they did routine maintenance, planned advanced replacement of that transformer just so that it would be reliable. But something about the particular system they're using in my neighborhood, at least for my house, results in what I'm guessing is some type of switching that results in minor voltage dips. So I can occasionally see my lights dim momentarily. Sometimes it's just a split second. I can just barely flash and I look up like, did I imagine that? And sometimes it's, say, 1 second, and my UPSs actually have time to detect it and kick in. And that is definitely specific to my neighborhood and whatever the system is in place from 1970s, right, when this tract was built, and it results in that quirk. I've never had that particular situation anywhere else in my entire life. So it really depends down to the neighborhood level how the energy is implemented. And I even had a situation where I previously lived where I was at the end of the block, and literally I had issues at the end of that wire feeding my house that someone 8 houses up the street did not have because they were closer to the transformer. And so there was energy drop along the line as it went from house to house. So during the summer, as everyone had their AC on, my voltage would dip lower than 10 houses at the beginning of the block. And so I had to deal with the electrical company for months to get them to fix that, to step up the voltage on my line so that my house was not dipping down to 112 volts, which started to freak out everything in my house. So anyway, it really depends, literally down to the house in a neighborhood as to what the symptoms might be. But this, I think, was a fairly good summary. But every single discussion of energy, there's someone complaining that it's this or this, that. So Eric and Jeremy are talking about profit, and it may be, but it's decades of something that has resulted in that. It's not some single occurrence that can be solved today. So you have to, if you want to blame policies from 50 years ago, you can, but that doesn't solve any problems. So why else does some crazy guy in California have generators when it's sun and, perfect weather all the time? Well, you might be aware that California has something besides sun. We have this thing called earthquakes, and they are fun. This is the 1994 Northridge earthquake, and I was in greater Los Angeles at the time. I was at college at a city called Claremont, about 60 miles or so away from downtown Los Angeles, out east. And I was in the 8th story of a dorm. It was a tower dorm. And on the 8th floor, 4 a.m. or something like that, our building started to sway. And literally, the door is banging, the windows are rattling. My roommate at the time, he jumps out of bed at 4 a.m. screaming, "Earthquake, earthquake!" And what is the one thing he does? This is in 92, 93 or something like that. He jumps out of bed to grab his VCR and television on some cabinet because that was his cherished possession. And so, we could all be dying, I don't know, but he's grabbing his VHS VCR on top of his cathode ray tube TV. I never forget that. And I was from Vegas. I wasn't used to earthquakes. So I'm like, shut up and go to bed. I'm tired. So I'm just laying in there during the whole time going to sleep. So anyway, yes, I was in California during this time. This is a 6.7 magnitude, which is not as large as some other earthquakes, but it had a roughly 80 mile or 130 kilometer radius. So just massive in scope in the area that it affected. And what was very different about this particular earthquake was the particular type of movement. I guess, they had assumed that most earthquakes have a shifting or a back and forth sliding. My recollection is that the explanation is that this particular earthquake had a vertical component that they had never observed in a severe earthquake before. And it resulted in the highest earthquake G-force ever recorded, apparently in the world, with forces 2.8 times higher than the building code expected at that time. This is the California Earthquake Building Code in the 1994. So it just absolutely destroyed buildings, and you can see roads here. And, major damage was kind of contained within a certain area, but it really rattled things in LA. 11 hospitals, I was reading Wikipedia, 11 hospitals were damaged or rendered unusable. So, it's a problem. And I see there's a discussion. So, Eric says he's a socialist in the context of essential services and infrastructure. And that might work in some countries, but in the U.S., I don't think anyone is cheering on for the U.S. government to take on any essential infrastructure. The U.S. Postal Service is a great example. Social Security is another example. So not to get political, but fundamentally, the U.S. government is not who I want in charge of my energy. So they don't have a great track record long term. So what do we do about these earthquakes? Well, it's very real. So aside from earthquakes, I have to deal with earthquakes, fires, and flood in California. So back in July 2019, I posted a video of a 7.1 magnitude earthquake. And it lasted so long that we had friends over. It was like a dinner or whatever, we all had to go outside, and we're all standing there as the ground is shaking, the house is swaying, and my pool is literally just sloshing out left and right. So that's my, Southern California seismograph, is how much water sloshes out of my pool. And there's a video there where you can just see it sloshing back and forth. And so that's the earthquake side. And in addition, we have several dams and reservoirs throughout California, some small, some large, but I am required by my mortgage, home mortgage, to have FEMA flood insurance. And flood insurance has ended up being consolidated through FEMA, our federal emergency management agency. And so because all the insurance companies went bankrupt at some point in different regions, so they said, I'm out of here. And so now that's a national flood insurance program that I have to pay for. And then because I'm in California, for some reason, they don't require this of me, but I finally got earthquake insurance. And not a lot of people have this, but it doesn't take much to have $50,000 in damage in a house due to a 5 or a 6 magnitude earthquake. Strangely, roof damage is common here because I think they have the concrete and tile roofs that are very heavy. So when the house starts shifting, that roof is swaying in the opposite direction. It's got that momentum and mass, and it actually causes roof damage, chimneys fall over. So after this one, that was very common. Roof repairs constantly, chimneys fall over. So in my region, it's earthquakes, fires, and floods. I'm in the urban area, so fires are not as common in our area, but any of the outlying areas of Southern California, houses on hills, you'll see the dramatic photos every single summer where the hills are just literally blazing, looks like an apocalypto movie, and people have to evacuate. So that's fairly common, but you know it if you live near brush. It's brush fires. But wait, there is more. And so 2011, there was someone maintaining some major substation somewhere in the Arizona, New Mexico region, and they made some mistake. They flipped some switch or did something out of sequence, and I feel sorry for whoever that was because they were not popular. And that resulted in the 2011 Southwest blackout. That was September in 2011. 7 million people throughout the Southwest region. I think it was Arizona, New Mexico, potentially Las Vegas or Southern Nevada, and Southern California region, potentially affecting the border with Mexico. And 7 million people as a result of 23 distinct cascading failures on 5 separate power grids over 11 minutes. So this guy made one mistake at that substation. That caused something to shut down. That induced an overload or underload that another, adjacent grid tried to compensate for. Well, that overloaded that portion of the grid, which caused an overload fault to kick in, and circuit breaker kicked in. That shut that down. Well, that caused power to flood another grid, and it was this cascade of 23 events that just shut everything down. So the dominoes fell, and that was due to improper design and implementation of those sequence of events. It was an unanticipated cascade of events. That would never happen, right? Anyone who knows complex systems knows that the failures occur in ways that you just didn't anticipate. Kind of like us fun software developers, we get to see a user do something like, I would have never thought a user would try to have entered emojis as the customer ID in Business Central. Well, I've tried, and amazingly it works. But, people do crazy things that you would never anticipate. 2011 Southwest blackout was one of those. Coincidentally, right as that's happening, I'm listening to this on the radio. I'm driving from wherever I was driving. I don't normally go this route, but coincidentally, I might have been coming back from a client. I am driving past the Honda Motorsports and Honda Power store. So I was aware of the store, but I'd driven by there before, but I don't have motorcycles or ATVs or anything, so I'd never go there to buy anything. But it was Honda Power. I literally am driving through as I'm listening to this radio story about this power outage of 7 million people, and I'm like, I've been thinking about it. So I turned around, made a U-turn, drove in the lot. I said, give me a Honda generator. And they had one left. It was all prepped, ready to go, in and out, in the back of my car. I had a generator. So it was that easy. Those coincidences, and I'm like, done. Now I just have this one checked off the list. 1 month later, 2011, there was this massive storm, winter storm in the northeast of the United States and I believe up into eastern Canada. So the entire northeast of North America was just hammered. And that I couldn't find good details of exactly what caused the outage. I'm assuming massive snow and ice caused the external power lines to fall and get damaged. Tree falls, wind, typical weather-related events. Some places had over 32 inches of snow. That one was 3.4 million people, some for 11 days, because there were major power lines that got taken down. And if you're slightly rural, it may take days for them to bring up the major infrastructure and then fix all the subsidiary lines to that area. So that was a pretty big deal. So I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of people. So Jeremy says he lived there. It was the ice. Yeah. I recall the stories of like the ice would freeze on the lines. It would keep building up and literally it's hundreds or thousands of pounds of ice just causing the lines to fail. It's like, what are you supposed to do? And you say, well, bury the lines. Well, that doesn't take care of your long haul lines that need to be high voltage. In the US, just because of the distances involved, those have to be overground power lines. And so those are susceptible to weather events. And then more recently, you may have heard, just February of 2021, Texas had a really weird cold spell that the low pressure zone really dipped below Texas, and they just had a massive freeze there down to, I think it was below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, so well below freezing and very, very cold. And that portion of Texas, my understanding, it's just not designed for that level, that temperature. And it's not just people said, oh, the power grid, this and that. Well, houses aren't. You don't have wrapped pipes and you don't have frost-proof pipes there. You have the ranch house with the external copper bib for your hose outside. And they might have done okay, but then the power went out. Like whatever the cause, people argue about that. And again, everything is a political argument where people rant. I don't care about that. The point is the power went out. And when it's 8 degrees and the power goes out and your house is not designed to deal with that temperature, your internal pipes freeze. There are these just wild photos of a ceiling fan. The pipe above in the floor above froze and burst, and the water cascaded out on the ceiling fan. And because it's 8 degrees in the house, it froze solid. So it's like this giant ice chandelier on the ceiling fan. You're like, that's 150 pounds of water hanging from a ceiling fan. Just crazy, crazy damage. And there are cars in parking garages where the parking garage pipe broke and the car is in an 8-foot pile. It's just a block of ice. The entire car is literally encased in a block of ice. It's crazy. And so you say, well, they should have dealt with that. Well, that's literally billions of dollars in construction costs to increase the R factor and the construction standards and other things in Texas over the last 80 plus years to accommodate a once in 100-year event. I don't know what the timeline was for this one, but very, very unusual. So it's like, okay, so I want at least to have power in those situations. And if you're in the Midwest, you've got tornadoes, you've got floods. If you're in the East, you've got hurricanes and floods. So, U.S. is just a big country, 3.8 million square miles. And I don't know if that includes Alaska and Hawaii, but for simplicity of the graphics, we have the mainland contiguous United States, 3.8 million square miles, 9.8 million square kilometers, 330 million people, urban to extremely rural. Like you just can't. It's an infrastructure challenge regardless of who tries to tackle that. So, I don't mind having some UPSs and a backup generator. I'm, in the minority by far. And so in California, at least, I thought, well, this is not a big deal. I live in California, earthquakes, and it's very common to hear discussion of California earthquake preparedness. And so I just thought it was common knowledge. California has multiple emergency preparedness organizations. Some are on the earthquake side, some are just on the natural disaster fire, typical problems that occur in large states. And the recommendation is that you have enough food, water, and gear for 3 full days per person. Now, if you think about that, the first reaction I normally have is, okay, what does that even mean? How many gallons of water, how much food, and what do I need per day? I don't even know. And I've looked it up before. It's like so many gallons per person per day is like the recommended level. And you can get by with less. I think that's the comfortable level. But 72 hours per person. I have 4 people in my house. And guess who has to take care of all of this? Well, let me tell you, it's not my wife. And it's not my 2 kids, so it's dad who has to take care of his family. So I keep 30 gallons of emergency water that I rotate every month. So I'm constantly rotating those 30 gallons. Now, is that good enough for 4 people? Probably not according to these guidelines. So that's 30 gallons divided by 4. Let's say that's 7, 8 gallons per person. Is that enough for 3 days? It's probably close. And we have a pool for, utility water, washing dishes or whatever we might need. We can boil that if we wanted to. But so I think I'm in the prepped. I bought some emergency food. We had this pandemic thing, so that was a good lesson. And I've got all this other stuff. I've got the generator. Probably don't have a plan. I have first aid kits and all this stuff. So this is routine for me. Like living in California, I'm an Eagle Scout. I've done the first aid, the whole be prepared thing. So I've lived my entire life this way. So it's not like it's just a habit for me. It's just the way I live. So anyway, yes. So just some discussion. So lots of discussion. So discussion of Texas. Yeah, Texas is just not built for that. So of course they're going to have massive ramification from that very rare event. Now, will this become more common? Who knows? We'll have to see. But I don't mind preparing for the 1 in 10-year event. That's easy to do. 1 in 100 event gets hard because I just don't have the imagination. Like, what is a 1 in 100 event? Massive earthquake, massive fires, massive floods in California? Like, my imagination is just not that good to understand what apocalypse we're going to run into. Like I would have thought zombies before I would have thought, a contagion of a global outbreak of COVID. But, and then what else here? In Switzerland, we used to store 2 weeks of food for the household in case of nuclear attack, including water and radio. Yeah, I grew up in the 80s, right? The whole Cold War thing. But my perspective as a kid is like, well, like, what are you going to prepare for, right? That's end of the world as we know it, right? That's apocalyptic type prep. And that's pretty hard to prepare for. That's a multi-year regimen, right? So 2 weeks of food and water. Yeah. So like, I'm just trying to be realistic. If I can get 3 days in case of power outage, water disruption, we can at least live until help comes or we can get out, whatever the case is. It's the hunker down emergency kit. And so it's just totally normal for me. So what's the point of this? Let's try to tie this back into the business world. So electrical outage, that's what my UPSs are for. And whether that's momentary, which it typically is. For me, it's typically less than 1 second outage. And I don't care about that fundamentally, but my computers do. So they're much more sensitive to that. So my router, my network, my NASs on RAID especially, my servers, I have UPSs just to keep continuous power. And I pay extra just so that I can handle a 1 second outage and I can handle a 1 hour outage. So I'm willing to pay extra because I don't want to run around like a crazy chicken shutting down everything within a 5-minute battery backup window. I want to leisurely finish my call and stroll around if I want to shut things down or have plenty of time to fire up a generator. Internet outage, that can be easy or complicated depending on what you are. If you're a business with a big pipe, internet outage may be hard to do a backup. You could have a redundant line coming in the other side of the building, but that line may just route around the building and be in the same manhole cover that gets plowed by a bulldozer in the same street at the same time. So you may be paying for redundant internet connections, but at some point, those two may merge and wipe out both internet connections. These days, fortunately, we have cell phones and mobile data as a hotspot. But again, in an extended power outage, that may go down as well. So someone asks, have you installed a switch box for your generator? Yes. So I used to run extension cords. I had 300 feet of extension cords going to different places in my house, my office for my computers, the kitchen for the refrigerator, upstairs for my router and switches. And it was a nightmare. It took me 45 minutes to get all that run and plugged in and set up. So when I replaced my electrical panel, I just paid a little bit more and had a separate consumer grade transfer switch plugged in or installed and got that permitted and installed. It took some effort because no one in California understands transfer switches because virtually no one has backup generators. It's uncommon in Southern California. We just don't have the weather for it. So I finally, I bought my own transfer switch. We finally got through permitting with my clueless city who had never seen this before. My electricians had never done it before, so they had to read the instructions. And yes, it's wired up. So I fire up my generator. I plug in one 30 amp plug in the bottom of that transfer switch. And then I use the circuit breakers to selectively power the circuits in my house. So seamless, but I'm going to venture I am the only house in my residence in my city that has one of these because I'm just a geek in that area. But yeah, it's much easier than running extension cords, which most people would do. So yeah. So electrical outage, internet outage, there's only so much you can do for those. You can do it, but electrical outage, I had a customer in Manhattan Beach, California, and fairly sized business in one of those big concrete tilt slab buildings. And they had a kind of a pseudo manufacturing and assembly facility for their business. And then they had offices. And they have this big diesel generator out back by the parking lot. We'd walk by it every day when we went into and out of the building. And they're like, yes, we have this backup diesel generator. We're good. Well, turns out some crows were hanging out on a transformer near them. And something happened. They got partying, and a couple of crows bridged the wires or caused something that caused that transformer to literally explode and short out and, sparks everywhere. So not only did that cook the birds, but it blew up the transformer and took out power for that entire area. It was on a power pole, so again, exposed infrastructure. And that not only took out power to the business, but sent a massive surge into that business that fried a lot of their electrical infrastructure. Now, I don't know what UPSs they had or what exactly fried, but I think their telephone system was fried. So apparently something didn't have the capacity to handle that level of surge. So then additionally, their generator apparently wasn't configured or set up properly. It didn't even turn on. Not that it would have helped if all the infrastructure got fried, but so they had a massive surge and an outage, damaged infrastructure, and their generator didn't work. So, they weren't prepared. Even though they had this big thing in the parking lot, it was useless in the end. And even if it would have worked, their damage prevented them from even using it to stay up. So they had to do a lot of work to get back up. Ransomware, right? Just huge hassle. I've got backup after backup after backup after GitHub repo after OneDrive. Like I've got all these, I hope, redundant backup options so that if ransomware does hit one of my computers, I can wipe everything and just recover from backup. That's my goal. Like I'm not going to deal with the ransomware. It's just like, even if I have to throw away the hard drives, fine. I'm okay with that as long as I can recover from backup. Have I tested my backups? No. So what's next on this list? Bad backups. I have not fully tested all of my backups because I've got like 6 of them. It's just a nightmare, and I empathize. I should, but yeah. And so what are you going to do? And so GP Geek says, in my previous business building, they had a huge diesel generator for the entire building, but it ran out of fuel after 10 minutes because the janitor forgot to check the level on a regular basis. Yes, and the huge problem with diesel generators is the fuel. The fuel lasts no longer than pump gas, even if you treat it. And so both pump gas in the US with ethanol and diesel, by definition, will degrade. They will oxidize, go bad, turn into sludge, and apparently bacteria even grows in diesel fuel along with water collection. So it will not only ruin the diesel fuel, it will actually ruin the tank. So you have to pay for a commercial service that comes out and services the diesel fuel. They will pump it out, they will treat it, they will clean it, filter it, then they have to clean your actual diesel tank. So if you aren't doing that, like, you'll fire up your diesel generator all proud, and it's just going to slog all that gunk in the tank, and it's going to shut down and be damaged. So I've looked into this for years. Pump gas, nightmare. Diesel, absolute nightmare. I don't know how the military deals with diesel fuel. Like, they've got diesel generators all over the place in businesses. Like, are these people doing the proper maintenance? Yep, as he mentions, propane or natural gas, those are the way to go. So my friend who has that big generator, he's going to have this, 20,000 gallon or whatever absurd size propane tank installed, and he's going to have to fill that because my understanding is that just does not degrade. It's propane or natural gas are your only long-term options for generator power. Bad backups, as I mentioned, I have not tested all my backups. I'm guilty, but it's really hard. Service provider outage. So, as I mentioned, Azure, AWS went down this week as well. It's happened several times in the last several months. Employee loss. I had a company, I don't know if it's a customer or partner, contact me because one of their key developers was in the hospital. And they're like, yeah, he's in the hospital, very severe. We don't think he's going to make it. Can you help us with this? And I'm like, I can't. They didn't know where his files were. They didn't know where the code was. They didn't have the repo, and nothing was documented. I'm like, sorry, there's nothing I can do. I can look at what it is, but unless you want to rebuild it, I can't help you. And so they had to deal with losing an employee. And so it's that's really difficult, right? And then, of course, fire, flood, storm. So, to deal with that, you can have a backup generator, but again, that's not a panacea. You can have backup internet. You can think you have backup internet, let me say. You can think you have a backup generator, like a security blanket, but it could be a totally false backup. You can have on-site and on-site backups, but unless you're testing them, how do you know they're any good? I worked for a client that had 2 full-time Oracle DBAs on site. When they had to recover from one inconsequential Oracle database, they realized none of their backups were good. 2 full-time Oracle DBAs, it must have cost a fortune. None of their backups worked. On-site, off-site backups. So why don't we do things? Cost, very expensive overall, both in investment and time. Hassle, they're a hassle. Well, risk, what's your risk? If you're not an earthquake country, you don't need to deal with earthquakes. If your power never goes out, maybe you don't invest in backup power. If your internet never goes out, you may think you don't need a backup until you do, right? What are your business needs? If you're 100% in the cloud, you don't need to support servers and UPSs and all this stuff, right? What is your geography? If you're in a major urban city, that's different than if you're out in the middle of the Midwest, 20 miles away from the nearest fire station or power station or whatever. So it really depends. And while looking through this, I just happened to come across this ransomware story. Apparently this is out of the UK, and it looks like this is a conglomerate or a parent corporation that has a bunch of subsidiaries, something to do with home sales and moving, or logistics companies that'll help you move from one house to another. And apparently there are multiple companies owned by the same organization that was hit with ransomware. And this was in 10th of November, when this got reported in the news. Well, if you go to their website today's the 17th of December, their latest notice says updated December 14th. Over a month, and they are still down. Their website is inoperable. So there are people who had moving trucks loaded up with all their furniture, and this company just vanished off the face of the planet. Customers couldn't contact them. They had no idea where their stuff was, where it was going. Could they move in? Could they move out? Apparently, it's quite a mess. I haven't found any more recent articles about what's going on, but yeah, over a month. And so they probably didn't have backup. So they may not recover and go out of business, and poor customers, right? So it's crazy. So you got to assess your risk, and don't want to be a downer, but I personally enjoy it. Like I find it fun. I think the generator thing and the UPS is kind of a geeky computer thing. So I've learned a ton. So now I know about, residential generators. I know about transfer switches. I know about the fuel requirements. So I've got my pump gas, but I have to rotate that constantly because even with stabilizer, it really doesn't last 12 months. So I rotate it every 6 months. But the side benefit is I now have 10 gallons of gas. I can fill up one of our cars if we need to, which I've needed to do a couple times if you've seen the photo on Twitter. Not saying it's my wife, but yeah, I have had to fill up my wife's car a couple times from the pump gas I keep for my emergency generators. So it's had some pluses. I found some ethanol-free fuel. And I've learned a lot about resiliency and redundancy and disaster prep and things like that. So yeah, it's been helpful. It's not a big investment. It's just kind of a habit you have to get into. Brushing your teeth, eating properly, right? Taking care of things. It's just maintenance. So yeah, I don't mind. Anyway, that was a random journey. It's much longer than I thought, over an hour. So for the 4 of you remaining, cheers. Thanks for watching. And happy holidays. I think I'm going to go, I'm going to go have lunch with my daughter. She gets out from school early today, so I'm going to take her to In-N-Out, and we're going to grab a burger and fries and hang out together. And yeah, so happy holidays. Let me know if you want to chat about geeky disaster recovery stuff and backup power. Like, it's my thing. So happy holidays. Have a good week. Have a good break. Happy New Year's if I don't do another stream before then. And yeah, go break something. Okay, have a good one. Okay, which button here? Okay, I'm out of here.
Do, do, do.